סליחה, שכחתי לדבר עברית. נולדתי בישראל, אבל שכחתי לדבר עברית. אני מדבר הונגרית, אבל today I'm going to speak English, okay? How many of you do not understand English? Okay, that's good. That's good. That makes it easy for me. I also apologize, not just for not speaking Hebrew, but some of you were at a similar event we had yesterday in Jerusalem, and you're free to leave because you're going to hear the same thing all over again, you know, so I apologize for that as well. First of all, thank you all for coming. It is really very, very meaningful to me that this book is being released and published here in Israel and Hungary and the United States, but it only matters if people bother to hear the story of my father and to read the book. And the very fact that you came here means a lot, so thank you very, very much for that. And of course, thank you to Anna Szalai, who made this book possible. And what I'm going to share with you today is two things. One is the origin of the book, how it came about, and second, the significance of the book, why I think it's important. I'll tell you how it came about. About 2 years ago, I get a phone call or an email, I don't remember, from some guy I never heard of who lives in Miami, Florida. And he gets in touch with me. We by then live in California. And he says, I have a cousin in Israel. She's originally from Hungary. Her name is Anna Szalai. She seems to have an interest in your father's life. She'd like to speak with you. So I said, sure. So then somehow he arranges for Anna and I to get on the phone. And we get on the phone. I'm in California. She's in Israel. Anna speaks Hebrew and Hungarian. I speak Hungarian and English. So of course we speak in Hungarian. And for 2 hours, I mostly listen as Anna tells me all sorts of stories that she has by then researched about the life and times of my father, about which I knew very, very little. And at the end of this 2 hours, a remarkable conversation, I said to her, you want to write this book? She told me she wants to write this book. And I said, by all means, please write the book, and if I can help you by funding it, I'd be delighted to do it. She didn't ask me to do that, but I was happy to do it. And off she went to continue her research, to the point that today, many of you have seen it, this book has now come to fruition. It's a book with 400 pages, in very unusual Hebrew, English, and Hungarian, all in one place, deliberately, because the life of my father was pretty much in Hebrew, Hungarian, and English, also German, but 4 languages would have been a bit too much. And it's also a very large book. It's not the kind of book you can take to bed with you and read, unfortunately, but we deliberately wanted to make it something that captured not only his life and times, but visually some of the graphics and some of the posters and the pictures of him and the world in which he lived. And therefore it's a book in 3 languages that's quite large, just physically. And I must say that the whole process of getting this book done, most of which was Anna's research and writing, but a whole team of people ultimately got involved in translating it, in researching it, in finding photographs and films, some of which you'll see tonight, and bringing it into Hungary, etc. It ended up being quite a project, but it would not have been possible had it not been for Anna. And which leads me to why I think it's important, why it has become such a gratifying, really important part of my life and my family's life, in ways that were totally unexpected. It's not like I said, go do a book. She came to me and said, I want to do a book. And I think it's significant for 3 reasons. And I wrote a little foreword in the book which talks about this. One is historical, one is biographical, and one is personal. Those are the 3 reasons. The historical part, and you're quite right to point out that there's a lot of stories and history involved, and it's remarkable that it has never really been told, and that my father's name is not better known. It's understandable because he wasn't a celebrity, though he did some amazing things. But the historical part is really about, through him, the story of what happened in the first half of the 20th century, pretty much up to the 1960s, in the whole world of, you can think of it as Hungarian Jewry, you can think of it in terms of Central European Jewry, you can think of it in terms of the world between the wars, you can think of it in terms of Aliyah, Hungarians who came to Israel, or other Central Europeans who came to Israel. It really encompasses all of that. My father was born in 1895. Today he would be 123 years old. He was 55 when I was born. He was 23 years older than my mother. So he really lived in the first part of the 20th century. He served in the First World War. He was decorated in the First World War. He apparently was very proud of having been a hero in the First World War. And after the First World War, where things in Hungary were actually very good for Jews. There was a lot of freedom, there was a lot of creativity, there was a lot of professional success, a lot of lawyers and doctors and professors, people in the arts like my father who had it very good in Hungary. And this book tells about all of that through him and his compatriots. It also tells about what was going on in Hungary politically. Anna told me in that first phone conversation, when we first talked, she said to me, for example, did you know that your father was arrested in 1918, I think it was? I said, I don't know if he was arrested. Why was he arrested? She said, well, he was arrested because he was suspected of being a communist. There was a communist revolution or something or other. And he wasn't convicted, but he was arrested. I said, okay, I didn't know that. She said, did you know that 3 years later, in 1921, he was arrested again? I said, what was he arrested for this time? He was arrested for being an anti-communist, because at that time it was whatever that was going on. So his life, during that first period of the 20th century, was one where he lived and affected and reflected all of the turmoil and all of the opportunity that was available in Hungary. It really is a history of that period. And during that period, he was able to, through his own talents, but also because the Hungarians let him, become a very successful person in the cultural life of Hungary. The first person to bring in movies to Hungary from the US and from Germany. The first person to produce movies in Hungary, very good movies by the standards of the time. He directed them, he acted in some of them, he owned the movie theaters. He was what would today be called vertically integrated, he owned the theaters, he distributed and so on. Can you hear me? Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So he was able to make the movies, own the movie theaters. As I said, what today would be called vertically integrated. He was in all aspects of that world, and did so with a lot of energy and panache, but also to the credit of the Hungarian community at large. He was allowed to do that. And then, historically again, things started changing. Hitler was in Germany as of 1933. The Jewish community in Hungary thought it would never happen there, and for a long time they were right. And the Hungarian government, Horthy et al., to try to keep the Germans at bay, try to keep them out, but to appease them, started passing all sorts of laws, what today are called quotas, right? Or in those times there were numerus clausus. Only X% of the lawyers could be Jewish, only Y% of the doctors could be Jewish, only Z% of the professors could be Jewish, only so many movie theaters and other media could be owned or controlled by Jews. And my father then was beginning to lose some of the properties that he had, just like other Jews, as a result of that, but he could still continue, just like the doctors could still continue. And then, of course, there was this very bad time in Hungary, a relatively short time, 1944, March. The Germans were beginning to lose the war. In fact, the war would be over 10 months later, but that's when they got most viciously involved with exterminating Hungarian Jews. And depending who's doing the counting, somewhere between 500 and 600,000 Hungarian Jews in a period of 10 months, through Eichmann's very efficient management, were taken out of Budapest and Hungary. Something like 25% of the population of Budapest was Jewish, were taken out of there to Auschwitz and other camps and killed. My father, luckily, survived. We don't actually know, despite Anna's research, very much about that. I know from what he told me that he was hidden by what are called righteous Gentiles, some non-Jewish farmers outside of Budapest took him in and hid him for 10 months. Otherwise, he would have been exterminated too. So, and then he came to Israel, because I think after the war, having survived the Nazis and frankly the collaborationist Hungarians, who were not very nice to Jews at all, he then confronted a communist regime, which at first, and it's in the book, he thought would be a wonderful place under which to create art, which is what he always did. And for a while it seemed that that was the case. But then increasingly it became apparent to him that they were also going to be very restrictive about what could be said and what could be shown and what could be created. And he was fed up with them too and left. Well, of course, at that time, 1949, Jews from anywhere were welcome to Israel. And he ended up here. He didn't come here as a Zionist. He came by then with my mother. They had married after the war. He didn't come out of conviction. I think, frankly, he came out of convenience. Where else would you go if you were a Jew and you couldn't get into the United States, which you couldn't? So he came here. And he fell in love with the country. And his story is, again, historically, the story of Israel in the 1950s, when it was culturally and in many other ways a pretty raw place compared to what it is today. And he had a very important role, I think, in the cultural evolution of the country at its very, very nascent stage. Made some of the first films that were made here. I think the first one he made was about Jewish artists, Jewish painters in Israel. He made a film about them. And then he got very involved with Hungarian theater. There were a lot of Hungarians here. They didn't speak Hebrew, but they liked theater. So he created theater for them in Hungarian, and he took it all over the country. And it was apparently of a very high quality in terms of what theatrical production should be. He directed it, he acted in it, he put the whole troupe together. And it apparently was somewhat controversial, again I learned from Anna's book, because a lot of the Israelis at the time thought, well, if they already came here, give them theater in Hebrew, not in Hungarian. And I think my father's attitude was, there's only two choices. They're either going to go to the theater in Hungarian, or they're not going to go to theater at all, because they don't speak Hebrew. So there was Hungarian theater. He also was very involved with a very good newspaper here called Wikelet, Hungarian, very high-level newspaper. So again, he was formative in the cultural evolution of Israel in those early stages. And one of the things I took away from the book, which I think is an interesting thing that somebody else could write about, that in the period between the wars in Hungary, how influential Jews were in Hungary, culturally. And in those early years of the development of Israel, how important Hungarians were in this Jewish land culturally. That's an interesting kind of thing, because there was a disproportionate influence of Jews in Hungary, and I think there was probably a disproportionate influence of Hungarians in Israel in those respective periods. Kind of an interesting thing. Anyway, he then left, and in 1958, I think more than anything because he wanted to return to Central Europe. He was a quintessentially Central European person. He went back to Berlin, where he had lived. And there again, he was in the forefront of what was going on. Berlin, and he went there in 57, 58, lived there when the wall was put up, became vice chairman of the Foreign Press Association in Berlin. It was really pretty much the fulcrum of what was going on in the Cold War at the time. And he lived it, and he wrote about it. He wrote about it a lot back to Israel. And he seemed always to be, and Anna once told me this very eloquently, he seemed always to be where the action was, and he always seemed to influence the action, including in Berlin. Quite amazing. So this book, first and foremost, and it's the part I talk about the most, is a historical record. Yes, it's of my father, but through him. It's through all of these events and all of these trends that occurred in that first half of the 20th century. Quite an amazing historical record. So that's one level of influence, of importance to me. The second and third I will cover much more quickly. The second is, it's a really great biography of a guy, my dad, who had this amazing set of talents, quite unusual. He was a guy who knew how to direct, act in, produce movies, theater. He was a prolific and brilliant writer in journalism. He was a humorist. Everyone always, some people are here who remember him. He was always the person who was the center of attention, the most entertaining person in any room he was ever in. He was a guy who was amazingly erudite. He could recite, even I remember this, Shakespeare, verse after verse after verse in Hungarian. He had read everything. He knew a lot. Quite an amazing guy. I would call him sort of a cultural entrepreneur. He was never a particularly successful business person, not even in Israel, maybe especially not in Israel. And it wasn't easy for anybody in the 50s in Israel. But he was always innovating and doing and trying new things. And this book is his story as well as a historical record. And I think some of his personality and some of his talent comes through this book. Frankly, not adequately enough, simply because Anna didn't know him, and I don't remember him well enough to add that additional kind of flavor to it. But the facts are there.
Sorry to interrupt you. He was a very lovable person.
I was going to get to that.
Very special personality, right?
Aki knew him, one of the few people who was here. So the third reason that it's significant, and Aki just kind of touched on this, is really personal. Really personal. There were, between my father and me, distances which occur maybe for other people of that time. There was, first of all, a generational distance. As I mentioned, there was a big age gap between us, and that creates certain barriers, especially for a young person who isn't wise enough and mature enough to overcome the gap, which I wasn't. There was also a cultural distance between us. He was, as I said, quintessentially a Central European person, very erudite, very much in the humor, in the gastronomy, in the culture of Hungary, Eastern Europe, all of that. And I was someone very rapidly becoming, and very much wanting to become, an American and all that quick kind of thing. And that's not where he was at, and that was another gap. And then there was a gap which I think is very common, and that was I didn't know much, and he didn't say much about all of this history that I just mentioned. And I think there is a tendency for kids not to ask and for parents not to tell, especially if they suffer through a lot of difficult times, as he has had, as many of your parents did, or grandparents did. Or if anybody who's gone through difficult, traumatic times tends not to want to talk about it too much. And kids aren't smart enough or willing to ask a lot. And so there was this gap of knowledge in addition to a gap of generational gap and a cultural gap, a gap of knowledge. And Anna has closed that gap, I now know. But what I do know and remember very well, and I didn't need Anna's book to tell me that, is what Agi spoke about. And that is, I remember him very well, as a person who was full of love for me and for people in general, full of personality, full of generosity. He had to share everything he knew. He had to share his humor. He had to share. He was out there. Nothing was held back. And as a result, he was genuinely, and I've heard this from so many people, beloved by all who met him and all who were in his presence, either as close friends or really on the stage where he spent a lot of time, like I'm doing rather briefly tonight. Yeah, that's a great point. So this book, significance, as I said, is historic, it's biographical, and it's very personal. And for this, I'm really grateful to Anna, very grateful to Anna, because as a result, not only is the book available to whoever's interested in it because of its, subject matter, its times, and its the person. It's also available to me and my children, their children, as a historical record. And it's a gift from Anna to us. It's a gift from me back to my father. And in many ways, I think it's a gift for those who really need to know the record. And I look at you because I know you're a documentary filmmaker, and documentary filmmakers feel very importantly about really telling the story that needs to be told, and that's what this book does. My mother used to say, it's in my foreword, that you are where you come from, or where you came from. And she meant that not only as a geographical point, you came from Hungary, or you came from Romania, or Poland, or wherever it is, yes, that too. But you are where you came from as a matter of history and as a matter of culture, because it's in you. And what this book has allowed me to appreciate is how much I am where I came from, and where I came from is my father, as well as my mother, of course, and all that that connotes, which is what I just went through. All of that is somehow part of me, in me, without my having known it quite as much as until I read this book. And in that way, I'm really fortunate, because since this book has been developed, I've shared this story with several friends of mine in America, many of whom have nothing like my background, but other backgrounds. And I've told them that, this woman found me and wants to write a book about my father, and through this I've learned so much. And they all say, oh my God, you're so lucky, you're so lucky. I wish someone wrote a book like that about my father, or my mother, or my past. It's really a quite extraordinary thing, because everybody is where they came from. But not everybody is fortunate enough to know where they came from, to the extent that I now know because of Anna. That's a great gift. Last thing I'll tell you, and this is, again, somewhat personal, I think it's also in the foreword, is this. Actually, others pointed this out. I didn't realize it, but then I took it to heart. And that is that there are actually some amazing similarities between my father's career and my career. I think they were totally unintended, but they turned out this way. But there's a big difference which I'll get to. For example, my father was a journalist. He wrote a lot of stuff. I never did, but I was an executive for one of the largest, if not the largest, newspaper and magazine and book publishing companies in the world. So in that sense, I worked with newspapers. My father owned and ran a couple of movie theaters in Budapest, supposedly the two best or three best ones there. I later on was CEO of a company that was one of the largest operators and owners of movie theaters in the United States. Hundreds of movie theaters. My father produced and directed films. That's what they had in those days. I was at various times the executives of companies that created and produced and distributed videos and television and films, etc., etc. So in that sense, we have the similarity. But with two major differences. One is, for those of you who follow this type of stuff about films and Hollywood and so forth, in Hollywood, there are these terms about, there are two types of people. There's talent, and then there are the suits. Talent are the people who actually have a talent. You know, they can sing, they can dance, they can act, they can direct, they can write. Those are people like my father. The suits are people like me. You know, they're administrators and executives and business people. Not the same level of talent. Very big difference. And the second one is, it's not easy to become somewhat successful in that industry in the United States. It's highly competitive. It's not easy, okay? I get that. But when I think of the challenges that I had to face, and that many of my friends had to face in our careers, it's nothing compared to what my father and his generation had to face and overcome in their careers. We never had to go through 2 world wars. We never had to go through a Holocaust. Yes, I went through an immigration, but boy, it was a lot easier than the immigration he went through here, when he came here. The challenges, the difficulties that he, his generation, and many of you and your parents and grandparents had to face were far more daunting than anything I ever had to do, or any of my friends. And so while there are these similarities on the surface, man, I've learned to appreciate how much harder it was for them than it was for any of us. So all of this is a way of saying thank you to Anna for making it possible for all of us to get together here tonight, for me to have the pleasure and pride of this book, for others hopefully to read this book, and really on behalf of my children and my wife Marina, who's sitting right here, thank you very much for giving us this gift. So that's it.